Welcome to Dark History for Sleep. Tonight we begin the story of a child raised by ghosts who crowned himself emperor, then turned on his people with the fury of a god betrayed. This is the legacy of Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, and why his rule wasn't just cruel, but designed to break the human soul. He was born in 1530 in the Grand Duchy of Moscow to Grand Prince Vasily III and his second wife, Elena Glinskaya. From the very beginning, Ivan's life was shadowed by blood. His father died when Ivan was only 3 years old, leaving the toddler technically ruler of all Russia, an infant king with no power and no protection. What followed was not a regency, but a slow-motion coup. The Russian boyars, noble families with their own ambitions, swooped in like vultures. These powerful clans didn't care about the child. They cared about positioning. They poisoned, murdered, and manipulated, all under the roof of the royal Kremlin. While they drank and schemed, Ivan and his younger brother Yuri were neglected, nearly starved, and beaten by guards. The royal palace became their prison. Ivan learned early that power did not come from birthright. It came from terror. He started killing small animals for fun, cats thrown from towers, dogs skinned alive. Servants remembered the young prince's unpredictable cruelty, sometimes charming, then suddenly screaming, clawing, attacking. No adult dared discipline him. They feared what he would become, and they were right. By age 13, Ivan had seen his mother poisoned, his tutors beaten, and his allies exiled or executed. On the day he turned 13, he invited one of the most powerful boyars, Prince Andrei Shwisky, to court. In full public view, Ivan ordered him thrown to a pack of hunting dogs. They tore the man apart in the snow as Ivan watched, smiling. It was his first public execution. From that day forward, Ivan ruled not as a prince, but as a predator. In 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan made history. He didn't just accept the crown. He invented a new title. Tsar of all Russia, not Grand Prince, not King. Tsar, a word derived from Caesar, signaling divine and absolute power. No ruler of Moscow had ever used it before. Ivan was no longer content with influence. He demanded reverence. But the ceremony was more than pomp. It was a psychological declaration. By crowning himself Tsar in a deeply religious ritual at the Cathedral of the Dormition, Ivan wasn't just claiming power over nobles and peasants. He was claiming power ordained by God. In his mind, disobedience to him was heresy. At first he appeared enlightened. Ivan married a noblewoman named Anastasia Romanovna, not a foreign princess, but a Russian. Their marriage was seen as a stabilizing force. He created the Zemsky Sobor, a kind of proto-parliament. He codified laws, centralized taxes, and reined in corrupt nobles. For a moment, the people loved him. But beneath this new order was a sickness, waiting to bloom. Ivan's reforms were not rooted in compassion. They were driven by paranoia. Every law passed, every noble displaced, every bureaucratic improvement. It was all part of his growing obsession with control. Then in 1547 came fire. A catastrophic blaze swept through Moscow. Thousands died. Entire neighborhoods turned to ash. And the people whispered, this was no accident. It was punishment from God. Their young Tsar, once hailed as a blessing, was now seen as a curse. The people rioted. They stormed the Kremlin and demanded blood. Not Ivan's, but that of his relatives, the hated Glinskys. They believed Ivan's maternal family had brought the fire through sorcery and corruption. Ivan, barely 17, watched as his kingdom turned on itself. His reaction would define the rest of his reign. Instead of crushing the rebellion, Ivan panicked. He withdrew. He fasted, prayed, and spiraled inward. And when he returned, he came back changed. The old Ivan was impulsive, cruel, but human. The new Ivan would become something else entirely. Anastasia's steadying hand kept him grounded for a while. Under her influence, Ivan showed mercy, even generosity. He opened hospitals, patronized the arts, and funded education. But this was only the eye of the storm. In 1553, Ivan nearly died from a mysterious illness. On his sickbed, he asked the boyars to swear loyalty to his infant son. They refused. The nobles saw opportunity. A weak heir meant chaos, and chaos meant influence. Ivan survived. But he never forgot. From that moment on, he believed the boyars wanted him dead, that they were poisoning his wife, plotting against his children, waiting for their chance to plunge Russia into civil war. Whether or not this was true didn't matter. He believed it, and belief for Ivan was all that mattered. Soon, Anastasia fell ill. Her health declined rapidly. Her hair fell out. Her skin paled. Her strength vanished. In 1560, she died. Ivan wept. He screamed. He tore his garments and collapsed into grief. Then he swore revenge. He was certain, absolutely certain, that she had been poisoned by the boyars. There was no proof. There didn't need to be. His heart demanded vengeance. The man who had shown flickers of hope was gone. The monster was awakening. After Anastasia's death, Ivan's grief curdled into something monstrous. He no longer spoke of mercy or reform. He spoke of betrayal, and how it must be repaid in blood. Russia was not safe, he claimed, because her enemies wore no uniform. They wore smiles, fine robes, and the mask of loyalty. The boyars, the aristocracy, his own court, they would all pay. Ivan began withdrawing from Moscow for long stretches, retreating to monasteries and fortified estates. There he brooded, wrote sermons, drafted lists. His thoughts turned more apocalyptic by the day. He started signing letters as Ivan by the will of God, your humble slave. He was not just a czar now. He was a prophet of wrath. Then came the letter. In 1564, Ivan shocked the empire. He sent two messages, one to the church and one to the people. In them, he announced his abdication. He accused the nobility of corruption and rebellion, claimed he was no longer wanted, and declared he would abandon the throne. Panic erupted in Moscow. The church begged him to return. The commoners wailed. The boyars, terrified of losing their power in a civil collapse, pleaded for forgiveness. And Ivan, waiting, watching, returned. But not without a price. He made them grant him unlimited authority, no oversight, no shared power, no protection for the nobles. In exchange for resuming the throne, Ivan demanded the right to punish treason as he alone defined it. And so the oprichnina was born. It was a word few understood at first, but would come to fear more than death. It referred both to a territory and a system. Ivan split the empire in two. The oprichnina, his personal domain ruled by terror, and the zemshchina, the rest of Russia still under traditional rule. But in truth, there was no division. The oprichnina was the empire now. To enforce it, Ivan created a new army, his private death squad. They wore black, rode black horses, carried severed dog heads on their saddles as a symbol of their purpose, to sniff out and devour treason. They dressed like monks, but wielded whips, axes, and torture devices. They were called the oprichniki, and they were loyal to Ivan alone. What followed was a purge unlike anything Russia had seen. Homes were seized, children orphaned, wives raped, nobles and priests accused of imaginary plots and executed without trial. Entire families wiped out. Some were flayed alive. Others were drowned in freezing rivers or burned in public squares. The oprichniki didn't just kill, they performed. Victims were paraded through towns naked, humiliated before death. Confessions were extracted through screaming blood and mutilation. And always, Ivan claimed divine purpose. He believed, or pretended to believe, that this horror was holy. Meanwhile, famine spread, peasants fled, the countryside emptied. But Ivan wasn't done. In his mind, the nobility wasn't just rebellious, it was diseased, rotten. And if Russia was to survive, the infection had to be purged, no matter the cost. The Tsar had become surgeon, judge, and executioner, and he had only just begun. The oprichniki were not simply enforcers, they were instruments of psychological warfare. They rode through the streets like reapers, draped in black cloaks with hoods pulled low. Their faces were rarely seen. They carried whips carved with symbols of divine justice and blades that gleamed like ritual tools. Wherever they passed, silence fell. Children were hidden, curtains drawn, prayers whispered. Their violence wasn't random, it was theatrical. Ivan wanted the boyars to feel watched, hunted, and doomed. Accusations needed no evidence. A wrong word, a jealous rival, a forgotten debt. Any of these could lead to arrest. And once taken, you rarely returned. If you were lucky, you'd be hanged. But luck was rare. Most were tortured until their skin peeled. Some were roasted over slow fires. Others had boiling water poured down their throats. Ivan demanded that executions be visible, memorable, and public. Fear, he believed, was the only true loyalty. And still he demanded more. In 1565, Ivan sent his oprichniki to Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, a remote monastery palace. He called it his new capital. There he lived like a mad monk king. The halls were lit by candlelight. Hymns echoed through corridors. But behind the sacred chants were screams. Here, Ivan staged his own grotesque ceremonies. He would dress in religious vestments, bless his torturers, and then oversee the executions himself. He believed he was doing God's work, cleansing Russia of betrayal through sacred pain. Sometimes he killed with his own hands. He once forced a boyar to watch as his entire family was dismembered, then ordered the man's eyes gouged out. Another time, he commanded a mother to hold her dead infant while he preached on sin and punishment. These were not punishments. They were messages, and the message was clear. You are never safe. One of the most infamous massacres was the fate of Polotsk, a city accused of harboring traitors. Ivan personally led the purge. Thousands of civilians were drowned in the river. The water ran red. Survivors were buried alive. Children thrown into bonfires. And always, Ivan's gaze returned to the boyars, those whom he saw not just as rivals, but as enemies of God. Yet the nobility weren't his only targets. The church, once a sacred pillar of Russian identity, began to feel Ivan's wrath as well. When the Metropolitan of Moscow, Philip II, refused to bless the oprichniki's actions, Ivan had him defrocked, imprisoned, and eventually strangled to death in his cell. Even men of God could be silenced. By 1570, the oprichnina had become a nightmare. Towns were emptied, fields untended, starvation spread. Thousands fled to the forests or defected to neighboring states. Commerce collapsed, and all the while, Ivan saw these consequences not as failure, but as proof of his enemies' sabotage. and so he escalated again. Because too even. If Russia suffered, it meant someone needed to pay. By now, Ivan was not just feared, he was mythic. To many he had become something more than mortal, a divine punisher, a wrathful hand of God. To others he was simply mad. But Ivan fed off this ambiguity. In public he played both victim and judge. He wept in the cathedral, praying for Russia's salvation, then ordered an execution in the same breath. He fasted, wore sackcloth, and knelt in the snow. But his hands were stained with innocent blood. This contradiction wasn't confusion, it was strategy. You could never predict him, you could only fear him. Then came the event that would shock even the most loyal Russians, the massacre of Novgorod. Novgorod was no ordinary town. It was one of Russia's oldest, wealthiest, and most autonomous cities. Its merchants were powerful, its culture proud, its connections to the West well established. But Ivan was convinced, without evidence, that Novgorod planned to defect to Lithuania. To Ivan, that was treason. In January 1570, he and his oprichniki descended on Novgorod. What followed was not a military action, it was a ritual cleansing by fire and blood. For 5 weeks, the city was turned into a slaughterhouse. Homes were looted, monasteries desecrated, priests impaled, nobles drowned en masse in the Volkhov River. Thousands were slaughtered, not soldiers but civilians, women, children, the elderly. Entire families were erased. Pregnant women were cut open, infants dashed against walls. Witnesses described the snow as red with blood, frozen in pools beneath the corpses. Ivan personally led processions through the carnage, chanting hymns as if overseeing a sacred rite. His men forced monks to carry icons through the killing fields, praying for the Tsar's soul as they died. Estimates vary, but some say over 60,000 people were killed in Novgorod alone. And yet, when Ivan left, he blamed others for the horror. He claimed his officials had gone too far, that he had been deceived, that punishment was necessary, but perhaps excessive. Then in the same breath, he executed those officials for misconduct, not for the killing, but for not being efficient enough. This was Ivan's genius and his sickness. He created a machine of terror, then turned its failures into justification for more terror. By now, the country was unraveling. Fields lay fallow. Trade routes collapsed. The treasury was nearly empty. Entire provinces were depopulated. Yet Ivan remained obsessed with internal enemies, blind to the rot consuming his empire. And as his political mind decayed, his personal life descended into ruin as well. His second and third wives both died under mysterious circumstances. His fourth, Anna Koltovskaya, was sent to a convent. His fifth, Anna Vasilchikova, also died suddenly. Some historians believe Ivan poisoned them himself, paranoid, convinced of their betrayal. By this point he trusted no one, not his advisors, not his generals, not even his sons, especially not his eldest. Ivan's relationship with his children was shaped not by love, but by suspicion and rage. His eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, was raised to be Tsar. But that meant little in a world ruled by fear. The boy had been trained to lead, had shown intelligence and strength, and, crucially, had begun to question his father's decisions. He had spoken out about the famine. He had demanded more support for the military. He had married a woman without his father's full approval. To any other king, this might have been the sign of a strong successor. To Ivan the Terrible, it was treason. In 1581, a chilling event would mark the breaking point, one that would stain Ivan's name forever. It began with an argument. Ivan discovered that his daughter-in-law, his son's wife, was pregnant. She had been walking through the palace halls in clothes Ivan found inappropriate, too revealing, too proud. In a fit of sudden rage, Ivan struck her. Some say he beat her so severely that she miscarried. His son, horrified, confronted him. The room ignited with fury. Shouts turned to violence, and then Ivan struck his son in the head with his staff. Accounts differ on the weapon, a metal-tipped cane, a ceremonial rod, but the result was the same. The young prince collapsed, his skull fractured, blood pooling on the floor. Realization struck too late. Ivan reportedly fell to his knees, cradled his dying son, and sobbed uncontrollably. "I have killed my child. I have killed my child." For days he refused to eat. He prayed over the body, begged God for forgiveness, screamed in anguish was so loud that guards fled the palace in fear. But the damage was done. Russia's heir was dead. The nation fell into mourning, but also into fear. If the Tsar could murder his own son in a moment of rage, who was safe? Who could question him now? Who would inherit a kingdom steeped in blood? Ivan's paranoia deepened. He withdrew even further from public life. His decisions became erratic, impulsive. He executed trusted advisors on mere whim. He accused allies of plots that made no sense, of letters they never wrote, of whispers no one heard. And in the cities and villages, the people whispered too. Though never above a breath, they called him monster, prophet, demon, saint madman, and Tsar, always Tsar. By the end of his reign, Ivan had transformed Russia, not into a stronger empire, but a traumatized one. The Oprichniki had been disbanded, but their terror lived on in memory. The fields were empty, the court was broken, and Russia, once poised for greatness, had entered a long night of instability. But Ivan wasn't done yet, not until his final breath. The Oprichniki were more than Ivan's secret police. They were his mirror. He crafted them in his image, merciless, self-righteous, and terrifying. They rode black horses with black harnesses. On their saddles were two grotesque emblems, a dog's head for sniffing out traitors, and a broom for sweeping away corruption. But the symbols were more than metaphor. They really did carry severed dog heads, sometimes preserved, sometimes fresh. When the Oprichniki arrived in a town, they didn't march in formation or declare authority. They descended like phantoms, at night, with torches, chains, and screams. Their black robes made them look like priests, but their tools were for flaying, crushing, and burning. They were both enforcers and actors, terror as theater. At their peak, there were thousands of them. They answered only to Ivan. Their headquarters were in Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, where Ivan had transformed a holy monastery into his new capital, a perverse blend of church and torture chamber. Here, the Oprichniki trained, feasted, and plotted. Every morning began with mass. Every evening ended in blood. They raped, they tortured, they executed, but never without reason. The Oprichniki kept records, lists of those suspected of treason. No one was told why they were arrested. Most never got the chance to ask. And the methods? They were inventive. Some were sewn inside bear skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were boiled alive or roasted over slow fires, eyes gouged, fingernails torn, joints broken. Whatever the imagination could conceive, the Oprichniki delivered. And Ivan watched, sometimes from behind curtains, sometimes from his throne, sometimes face to face, asking questions as his victims screamed. But it wasn't just cruelty, it was strategy. Ivan believed terror purified. He believed Russia could only become great if its soul was purged of sin. And he believed that sin lived in the elite, the boyars, the clergy, and even the commoners who dared to think for themselves. So he let the oprichniki loose. Their prison was a performance. They entered a town, declared a holy investigation, and began interrogating. If anyone hesitated, they were beaten. If they begged, they were ignored. If they resisted, they were made an example. One such example was Torjok, a prosperous trading city. Accused of harboring disloyal nobles, the city was surrounded. The oprichniki arrested merchants, nobles, priests, anyone with money or influence. Some were hung upside down over fires. Others were submerged in freezing water until their skin cracked. When the executions were done, the oprichniki held a feast on the corpses. They laughed, drank, and mocked the dead as rats and demons. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the oprichniki wasn't just their violence. It was the silence they left behind. Survivors didn't speak. Families didn't mourn publicly. Towns didn't rebel. The memory of their black robes became enough to govern by fear alone. Even Ivan's allies weren't safe. One of his most trusted generals, Prince Alexander Gorbaty-Shwysky, had served him loyally for years. But after a successful campaign, Ivan had him accused of treason. He was tortured and executed, his entire family wiped out. No service went unpunished, no loyalty went unquestioned. Because to Ivan, power was not about trust. It was about dominance. The terror was spreading, but not just across provinces. It was invading the soul of the nation. In Ivan's Russia, suspicion was not a flaw. It was a virtue. The more paranoid you were, the longer you might survive. Children reported on their parents. Servants denounced their masters. Brothers betrayed brothers. Because to stay silent was to risk guilt by association, the oprichniki encouraged this chaos. They set up informant systems in every town, anonymous accusations, secret letters, whispered betrayals. There were no trials, no appeals. If your name was read aloud, it didn't matter if the evidence was fabricated. You were finished. Ivan had engineered a society where everyone was watching and being watched. He called it justice. But it was justice soaked in blood. And when the blood dried, it had to be replaced. One of the most disturbing accounts came from the town of Kashin. There, Ivan ordered the public execution of dozens of nobles and priests in a single afternoon. The condemned were tied to posts in the town square, their mouths stuffed with pages torn from religious texts. A crowd was forced to watch as the oprichniki read the sins aloud, then lit the executions ablaze. The smoke rose past the church spires, curling like incense toward heaven. To Ivan, this was sacred duty. To everyone else, it was hell made flesh. But the terror wasn't confined to the cities. In the countryside, peasants were starving. The land had gone fallow from constant raids, exiles, and mass death. The few remaining workers feared even speaking aloud, lest someone hear a wrong word. And still, Ivan demanded loyalty. When taxes could no longer be paid in coin or grain, he accepted flesh instead. Daughters, wives, brothers offered up to the oprichniki to avoid collective punishment. Rape became a common tool of rule. Entire villages were ordered to surrender young women to satisfy Ivan's holy men. Resistance meant annihilation. And through it all, Ivan began writing letters, long, ranting, deeply paranoid messages sent to nobles, priests, and foreign leaders. These weren't diplomatic, they were manifestos. He accused his enemies of everything from witchcraft to treason, heresy to sodomy. He kept meticulous records of imagined conspiracies, often writing entire monologues explaining his divine right to purify Russia through pain. One letter to Prince Kurbsky, his former general who had defected to Lithuania, ran dozens of pages, blending scripture, philosophy, and raw hatred. Ivan alternated between threats and tears, between damning Kurbsky and pleading with him to return. It was the writing of a man who had crossed into delusion. But that delusion still ruled with absolute power. Even foreign nations began to fear Ivan, not for his armies, but for his instability. Ambassadors were horrified by his court. Foreign dignitaries returned home with stories of dinner feasts, followed by beheadings, of holy processions ending in torture, of laughter interrupted by execution. Ivan's Russia had become a cautionary tale, a riddle of violence and vanity, and at the center of it all, a man who believed himself both savior and scourge. By the early 1570s, Russia was not just bleeding, it was gasping for air. The Oprichniki brutality had created a vacuum of labor, trust, and structure. Towns depopulated, trade routes collapsed, border defenses deteriorated. But instead of changing course, Ivan blamed the collapse on the one thing he hadn't yet destroyed, his own people. In his eyes, they were unworthy. He told foreign envoys that Russians were sinful, backward, and needed divine punishment, his punishment. To him, the famines and fires weren't failures. They were prophecies fulfilled, warnings unheeded. He believed himself a messiah of suffering. One tale from the period illustrates how twisted his sense of justice had become. A boyar in Pskov was accused of hiding wealth from the state. No proof, just a whisper from a jealous rival. Ivan had the man's wife stripped, marched naked through the snow, and beaten until her skin split. Then he ordered their children drowned in front of the man. Afterward, Ivan reportedly approached the boyar, embraced him, and whispered, "Now your soul is clean." These acts weren't just about control. They were about transformation, turning pain into supposed purity. But not even the Oprichniki were immune. Over time, Ivan began turning on them as well. Many had grown rich, arrogant, even admired by fearful peasants. Ivan couldn't allow loyalty to shift, so he purged them too. Some were tortured for minor errors, others were killed for imagined disobedience. Entire garrisons were executed for failing to produce enough traitors. Ivan began accusing his most trusted enforcers of being secret heretics, foreign spies, or hidden boyars in disguise. The machine was eating itself, and with the Oprichniki devouring their own, the state's remaining institutions collapsed further. There were no more checks, no balances, just the will of one man, filtered through a decaying system of ritual murder. Meanwhile, Ivan's court grew increasingly surreal. He surrounded himself with astrologers, mystics, and fake prophets. He held seances to speak with Anastasia's spirit. He demanded relics from across Russia be brought to his throne room, not to honor, but to control. He claimed voices from heaven were guiding his every move. At banquets, guests were forced to toast his wisdom, while executioners waited just outside the doors. One smile too wide, one phrase too careful, one fork lifted at the wrong time. It could all be interpreted as insult or conspiracy. Death came not by crime, but by misinterpretation. Foreign observers were stunned. Ambassadors from England and the Holy Roman Empire returned home with stories that bordered on madness. They described a court of contradictions, luxury surrounded by disease, music interrupted by screams, and a monarch who cried during executions, and then ordered more. The Russian people, once proud and resilient, were now hollow-eyed and broken. They spoke in whispers, they prayed behind closed doors, and they began to dream of a future without even. But no one dared say it aloud. To hope was to be heard, and to be heard was to vanish. By the final years of the 1570s, Ivan ruled not a kingdom, but a shadow of one. He had succeeded in silencing the boyars. The clergy bent their knees. The people did not resist. But this wasn't order, it was exhaustion. The empire still bore his crown, but the foundations were cracked, bleeding, and brittle. And still, Ivan turned inward, digging deeper into obsession. He became consumed with alchemy, searching for elixirs that might cure his decaying body, or perhaps extend his rule. He summoned mystics, astrologers, and foreign sorcerers, demanding spells that would grant him insight or eternal life. He obsessed over relics, ancient bones, blood-stained crosses, fragments of saints, and demanded they be displayed throughout the Kremlin like trophies. When one monk refused to turn over a holy relic, Ivan had the man nailed to the monastery doors, alive. At court, his behavior veered between brilliance and psychosis. He could still command the room with sharp political insight, dictating reforms or strategy with alarming clarity. But just as easily, he would descend into manic laughter, speaking to invisible figures, or accusing courtiers of plotting against him because of a dream. He ordered food tasters for every meal, guards to guard his guards. He slept in different chambers each night, often in secret passageways. Convinced assassins were always inches away. And perhaps they were, because in every corner of his court people had begun to fantasize about his death. They whispered prayers in secret, not for their souls, but for the Tsar's end. Some prayed that God would strike him down. Others dared hope he might simply wither away. But Ivan had survived too much to die quietly. Then came the letter. In 1579, Ivan wrote to Queen Elizabeth I of England, a bizarre and desperate correspondence. He proposed an alliance, a friendship, perhaps even asylum. He told her he might flee Russia and wanted permission to live in England if his people betrayed him. The most powerful man in Russia was now asking for refuge. Elizabeth never answered seriously. She sent diplomatic replies, vague courtesies, but the message was clear. Ivan's paranoia had become global. He wasn't feared as a conqueror, he was feared as a mad king. Inside Russia, his legacy began shifting, not because he changed, but because the people had grown used to the horror. For an entire generation, he had been the only ruler they knew. Children grew up in a world where public execution was a daily event, where screams were common and silence was a virtue. And so the myth of Ivan became more than man. He was now a legend of cruelty, a symbol of holy terror, a dark god carved into Russia's bones. But even legends decay. By 1583, Ivan was visibly deteriorating. His teeth blackened, his joints twisted. He could barely walk. He began losing control of his bowels during court sessions. His eyes rolled back during seizures. And still, he ruled. Still, he punished. Still, he prayed. And still, he feared his only surviving heir, the quiet, gentle, and deeply religious Fyodor, might not survive the chaos he would leave behind. The terror was no longer a tool. It had become his legacy. And soon, it would be all he had left. By the 1580s, Ivan IV, once the boy king of corpses, the Tsar who terrorized an empire, had become a living corpse himself. He no longer resembled the warrior who had crowned himself Tsar. His face was gaunt, drained of blood, his skin blotched with sores, his breath came in ragged wheezes, his once powerful voice, which had thundered over executions and mass prayers, now cracked with phlegm and pain. But he still ruled. Even as his body crumbled, Ivan's mind refused to let go. If anything, his obsessions deepened. He feared witches, Polish assassins, and the ghosts of those he had murdered. He claimed to see Anastasia, his first wife, long dead, walking the halls of the Kremlin at night. Sometimes he spoke to her, sometimes he screamed at her. At court, his paranoia took on new forms. He now believed his clothing could be cursed. Before dressing, he demanded each robe be exorcised by a priest. He believed food could carry demons. So he ordered every meal blessed, then tasted by at least 3 men before touching it himself. His doctors were constantly replaced. Some disappeared, others were publicly accused of poisoning his joints or weakening his spine. And his mind, once capable of navigating Russia's complex politics, was now a maze of shadows and delusions. He'd begin speeches to the court and wander into theological ramblings about the devil hiding in mirrors. He interrogated ministers about their dreams. He believed birds outside his window were agents of Satan. He forbade black clothing among the clergy, calling it the devil's feather. And yet, in this state, he was still the most powerful man in Russia. But power couldn't shield him from consequence. Russia was falling apart. The once mighty empire had lost lands to Poland and Lithuania. The military campaigns Ivan launched in his final decade were desperate, poorly supplied, and often ended in defeat. Foreign traders, especially the English, began pulling out of Russian markets. At home, famine spread again. Harsh winters, failing harvests, and war drained the country's lifeblood. In towns like Yaroslavl and Vologda, people resorted to cannibalism. Starving peasants exhumed graves, boiling bones for soup. But Ivan saw none of this. He sat in his chambers, draped in robes, demanding rituals and reports, praying not for mercy, but for victory over enemies who no longer feared him. Only Fyodor, his last surviving son, remained at his side. And Fyodor was everything Ivan was not: gentle, quiet, deeply devout. He had no taste for violence, no gift for politics, no hunger for power. He would spend hours alone praying in darkened chapels. The court whispered he was more monk than monarch. Ivan knew this, and it terrified him. He didn't believe Fyodor could hold the throne. But there were no other heirs. Ivan had killed one son. The others were dead or vanished. Fyodor was all that remained. So the Tsar began planning for his own legacy, not with hope, but with dread. He summoned foreign alchemists and scholars to design an immortal tomb, a crypt that would withstand the apocalypse. One report says he ordered drawings for a casket surrounded by spikes, mirrors, and fire traps to ward off grave robbers and evil spirits. He didn't trust death. He wanted to command it, and death was listening. By 1584, the Tsar's body was failing, and so was his control over time. He no longer marked days by court appointments or royal decrees, but by visions and rituals. His advisors tiptoed around his chambers, knowing one wrong movement could turn a discussion into a sentence of death. Ivan had become consumed by omens. Every crack in the wall, Every flicker of candlelight, every misaligned cross on a wall held meaning. One morning he demanded that all the icons in his chapel be rearranged. He claimed the Virgin Mary had turned her eyes from him in disappointment. He was right about one thing: the end was near. That winter, Ivan's condition visibly worsened. His back hunched, his fingers curled inward like claws. He could no longer stand for long periods and often urinated blood. He began fainting during court. One day, after rising too quickly from a bath, he collapsed and was unconscious for nearly an hour. The court froze, unsure if he was dead or merely pretending, because Ivan had faked death before. In previous years, he had staged his own collapse just to observe who panicked and who smiled. Those who smiled were later tortured or executed. So even now, as he withered, his own inner circle wasn't sure whether to mourn or remain silent. Only Fyodor stayed close. He helped his father eat, read to him from religious texts, sat at the edge of his bed in silence, absorbing his father's mutterings and rants. But Ivan, twisted by guilt, grief, and unrelenting suspicion, never thanked him. Instead, he began drafting lists of potential traitors Fyodor would need to purify when he took the throne. The old madness returned. Ivan started suspecting that Fyodor himself might be too weak, and perhaps must be replaced. But there was no one left. Ivan's other potential heirs were either killed by his own hand or dead by exile and neglect. So instead he tried to create a protector for Fyodor. He handpicked a regent council, nobles he believed were loyal. He didn't trust any of them, of course, but he believed a council of 5 could check each other's ambitions while guiding his son. In truth, this only planted the seeds for civil war. But Ivan didn't care. His focus had shifted to his own death. He called for holy men to purify his soul, confessing sins that shocked even seasoned monks. He reportedly wept during confession, admitting that he had killed thousands, perhaps more than he could count, but insisting it was done in service to God. He then ordered those monks tortured for knowing too much. The contradictions never ended. In his final days, he obsessed over legacy. He ordered portraits of himself painted with halos, depicting himself as both czar and saint. He wanted to be remembered not just as a ruler, but as a divine punisher, a holy warrior who had protected Russia through righteous violence. The court indulged him. What else could they do? And then, on March 18th, 1584, Ivan prepared for a chess game. He loved chess, one of the few things that seemed to calm his mind. That day he was in relatively good spirits. A servant helped him dress in a fur-trimmed robe. He laughed. He sipped wine. He moved a piece on the board, nodded, and then collapsed. He died moments later. Some said it was poison, others a stroke. There were no doctors brave enough to perform an autopsy. His body was hurriedly buried under layers of secrecy. Rumors spread fast. What was certain was this: the Tsar was dead, and the empire he left behind was broken, battered, and cursed. Ivan's death did not bring peace. It brought a vacuum. In life, Ivan had crushed any system that might function without him. He had executed the competent, exiled the bold, and left only the fearful behind. When he died, no one rejoiced, not because they mourned him, but because they were terrified of what came next. The throne passed to Fyodor I, his frail and passive son. But Fyodor was no ruler. His heart belonged to prayer, not politics. He delegated almost all power to his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, who effectively ran the country as regent. and thus began the time of troubles. The phrase sounds poetic, but it was a nightmare. A 2-decade-long spiral of famine, civil war, foreign invasion, and dynastic chaos. It was a period soaked in blood and plagued by uncertainty, and it all began with the ghost of Ivan IV. His reign had so thoroughly atomized the nobility that no strong successors remained. The boyars fought amongst themselves for scraps of influence. The peasantry, already starving from decades of war and terror, began to rise in sporadic revolts. The army was weak, demoralized, leaderless. Then the pretenders came. One by one, men emerged claiming to be Ivan's dead son, Dmitri, miraculously alive. Some were poor, others backed by Polish money. But they all had one thing in common: the legend of Ivan. His rule, for all its horror, had left a mark of brutal strength. And in Russia's chaos, even a phantom czar seemed better than the present reality. These impostors, called the false Dmitris, triggered wars. Entire regions fell under their sway. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth invaded, backing one Dmitri after another. Moscow itself was captured. Foreign soldiers marched through the Kremlin. Churches were looted. Nuns were raped. Priests executed. In a sick twist of fate, Ivan's legacy of terror became the only stability many people remembered. Even those who had feared him in life now told stories of his strength, of how the land was orderly, how the nobility trembled, how justice, though cruel, was absolute. They forgot or ignored the executions, the famine, the mass graves. In the face of national collapse, tyranny became nostalgia, but Fyodor would not live to see the full horror. He died in 1598, childless, ending the Rurik dynasty. For over 7 centuries, the line had ruled Russia. With his death, the country spiraled fully into anarchy. Bandit kings ruled provinces, foreign armies seized territory, cannibalism returned in the countryside, entire towns vanished from the map. And above it all, the shadow of Ivan the Terrible loomed. Paintings of him now hung in churches, his name spoken in sermons, not as a tyrant, but as a flawed hero. He was called God's Tsar, the man who had purged evil, who ruled with fire and blood because the world required it. His terror became myth. His madness became legend. And in the vacuum he left, Russia would suffer horrors even Ivan could never have imagined. Even in death, even the terrible ruled by fear. His tomb, buried deep within the cathedral of St. Michael the Archangel in the Kremlin, became a place of hushed footsteps and silent prayers. No one dared speak ill of him, even years after his death. To do so was to tempt fate, to invite madness, famine, or political ruin. Stories circulated that his spirit lingered. Some claimed that guards who mocked his name fell ill or vanished. Others swore that Ivan had made a pact with the devil, that his soul could not be contained by mere stone. Peasants spoke of hearing horses on dark roads, hooves pounding like thunder. The oprichniki, they said, still rode at night, black-cloaked and headless. And so, Ivan's legacy transformed once again. He became not just Tsar, not just tyrant, but mythic specter, a force that could not be exorcised. Even the Romanovs, who would eventually seize power and rule for 3 centuries, tread carefully around his memory. Publicly, they condemned his excesses. Privately, they studied his tactics, his strategies of centralization, terror, and myth-building became a blueprint for the next great empire. And yet, Ivan's personal descent into madness remained uniquely horrifying. In his final writings, found among his scrolls and half-burned letters, there were signs of a mind unraveling. He wrote to dead relatives, sent letters to churches that no longer existed. One note begged forgiveness from a child he had never fathered. Another warned of a silver-eyed demon hiding beneath his bed, whispering doubts about Fyodor's soul. One servant claimed that Ivan, in his last weeks, kept a locked chest near his bed. Inside were small dolls, each representing someone he had killed. Each night, he would remove one, whisper to it, then put it back. Sometimes, he'd line them up in front of the fire and scream until he collapsed from exhaustion. These are stories, yes, but too many exist to ignore. Ivan's madness was not just personal, it was nationalized. His paranoia became law. His hallucinations became policy. His delusions wrote history in blood. And the people who lived through it, they adapted. Because to live under Ivan was to learn survival as a language. You learned when to speak, how to bow, what to pretend to believe. You learned that truth was dangerous and memory even more so. You taught your children to forget, or to lie better than you ever could. Generations passed down not Ivan's laws, but his fear. And fear, unlike kingdoms, never dies. In many ways, Ivan didn't just rule Russia, he rewired it. The bureaucracy he created, one obsessed with central authority, surveillance, and suppression, remained intact. His reforms laid the foundation for serfdom to be institutionalized. His obsession with internal enemies would be echoed centuries later by men like Stalin. It's no coincidence that both men, though separated by time, used similar tools: torture, mass surveillance, cult of personality, historical revisionism. And like Ivan, Stalin too died watching over a country built on bones. The question was never whether Ivan was mad. The question was whether madness was Russia's natural state under power. Ivan's madness didn't emerge from nothing. It was grown, layer by layer, over a lifetime of betrayal, abandonment, unchecked power, and religious obsession. He had watched his mother poisoned, grown up in filth as nobles tore each other apart for influence, discovered early that love was fleeting and loyalty a transaction. That pain, delivered publicly, could shape a nation more effectively than kindness ever could. By the time he became Tsar, cruelty wasn't a strategy. It was identity. But even knowing this does not absolve him. Many rulers suffer. Few become monsters. And what set Ivan apart wasn't just the scale of his violence, but his justification of it. He believed, to the very end, that what he did was holy, that every torture, every burning, every drowned city was a sacrifice to God in exchange for national purity. And that belief made him more dangerous than any ordinary tyrant. In Ivan's Russia, morality was inverted. Mercy was sin. Violence was virtue. And loyalty meant surrendering not just your body, but your mind. This philosophy infected the state. It outlived him. It was embedded in the bones of the bureaucracy, the whisper networks. The fear passed down from parent to child. Even as Fyodor took the throne, timid, uncertain, a gentle shadow of his father, he inherited a throne soaked in blood, surrounded by wolves, and haunted by expectation. He could not lead as his father did, nor did he want to. And that was the tragedy, because the Russia Ivan built could no longer function without a tyrant. It had become dependent on pain, on surveillance, on purges. A gentle ruler, however kind, meant uncertainty, weakness, opportunity, and opportunity bred ambition. In the wake of Fyodor's ineffectual rule, the vultures descended. The time of troubles wasn't just a dynastic crisis, It was a reckoning, a purging of the rot Ivan had buried beneath decades of silence. False Dimitris rose and fell. Peasant uprisings broke into mass slaughter. Foreign kings placed their sons on Russian thrones, only to watch them be torn apart by mobs. And in the chaos, a myth solidified, the idea that only a ruler like Ivan, divinely mad, unapologetically cruel, utterly certain, could hold Russia together. It became a dangerous cultural seed, one that sprouted again and again through Russian history. Whenever Russia fractured, the memory of Ivan returned like a ghost, not as a warning, but as a template. And perhaps most chilling of all, many of his successors agreed. Centuries later, Joseph Stalin kept a statue of Ivan in his office. He admired the Tsar's methods, studied them, quoted them. Like Ivan, Stalin believed terror was not only useful, it was necessary. Like Ivan, he believed that a ruler must be loved or feared, but if forced to choose, always feared. Ivan had become more than a man, more than a memory. He was now a blueprint for tyranny, a twisted saint in Russia's gallery of power, and his madness was now institutionalized. By the time the 17th century dawned, Ivan's body had long since decayed beneath the cathedral floor. But his presence was everywhere, in whispers, in policy, in paranoia. And then, centuries later, his bones were disturbed. In the 1960s, Soviet scientists, under orders from the Kremlin, exhumed Ivan the Terrible's remains. The official reason? A historical study of royal burials. But many believed there was another motive: to examine the skull of Russia's most infamous ruler, to understand the mind that had rewritten the nation in blood. What they found was unsettling. Ivan's bones were deformed, his spine twisted, his joints fused by arthritis, his skull thicker than most men's. Some claimed it suggested hydrocephalus, a condition linked to intense headaches, mood swings, even psychosis. Others speculated he suffered from mercury poisoning, possibly from the medicines of the time, or self-experimentation. One Soviet pathologist quietly stated, "This was the skeleton of a man in agony, a man in torment." But perhaps the most symbolic discovery was this: even in death, Ivan had been buried with weapons. His crypt contained a dagger, a ceremonial staff, and relics of saints. He had prepared for eternity not with peace, but with defense, as though he feared judgment, as though he knew that if God came calling, it would not be with mercy. After the autopsy, his bones were returned, but the silence surrounding the examination only deepened the mystery. The state said little, the church less, and the people, even centuries removed, still hesitated to speak his name aloud. Because Ivan was not a relic, he was a mirror. He represented what power could do, not in isolation, but when unchecked, worshipped, and allowed to fester. He showed how easily a traumatized child could become a national disease, how a divine title once given could mask atrocities, how a ruler, convinced of his righteousness, could rewrite sin into sanctity, and how nations, once broken by fear, will sometimes cling to their tormentor for safety. The Russian soul, it said, is forged in contradiction, mysticism and reason, beauty and brutality, obedience and rebellion. Ivan captured all of it, lived all of it, inflicted all of it. He built Russia, then bled it dry. And for all his torment, for all his madness, he left behind something no army could destroy: a story. One retold again and again, in books, in plays, in politics, in power. A story where fear triumphs, where history is written in red, and where the man called Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, never really dies. Ivan the Terrible was dead. But his methods, his mind, and his mythology would echo for centuries, not only in Russia, but as a case study for the psychology of tyranny itself. He ruled not by inspiring greatness, but by erasing alternatives. His brilliance was poisoned by rage, his reforms soaked in blood, his spiritual devotion corrupted by the idea that pain was purification. So when modern historians look back, they don't just ask what Ivan did. They ask, why did a nation follow? The truth is hard. Russia, fragmented by Mongol invasions, divided by rival princes, and preyed upon by foreign powers, had long craved unity. Ivan offered that unity, but at a price paid in mass graves, mutilated bodies, and silence. And once a nation gets used to silence, it forgets how to scream. Or even today, in modern Russia, Ivan's legacy remains divided. Some view him as a madman, a killer whose name should be whispered only in shame. Others see a strong man, a savior who forged the Russian identity through fire. His statue stands in Oriel, erected in 2016, the first of its kind. Its unveiling was met with protest and applause. A woman wept. A historian shouted. A priest offered a blessing. That's the paradox of Ivan. He split a nation not only in life, but forever in memory. In art, he is portrayed as both beast and saint. In Eisenstein's 1944 Soviet film, Ivan the Terrible, commissioned by Stalin himself, Ivan is cast as a tortured genius, betrayed by his allies, misunderstood by history. The film ends not with a condemnation, but with a coronation of violence. The message? Sometimes cruelty is necessary. This perhaps is Ivan's most dangerous legacy, the justification of terror. Not in moments of desperation, but as policy, as identity, as virtue. Ivan created a blueprint that would be resurrected again and again. During the Romanovs, secret police hunted dissidents in the dark. During the Soviet era, the NKVD and later the KGB refined the Oprichniki's tactics to scientific levels. Informants, disappearances, interrogations, show trials. Under Stalin, whole cities were purged in the name of unity, entire ethnic groups deported, histories rewritten. All of it defended as necessary for the survival of the state. And each time, when challenged, the rulers could look back to Ivan. The first Tsar, the first executioner, the first to say, "I am Russia." But Ivan's story doesn't just belong to Russia. It's a warning to the world that any leader, no matter how pious, how intelligent, how visionary, if left unchecked, can turn from savior to destroyer. And that people, when terrified for long enough, will mistake brutality for strength. The question that lingers over Ivan's story isn't just how he became so cruel, but why so many accepted it. Why did priests bless his massacres? Why did soldiers obey unspeakable orders? Why did peasants whisper his name, like a prayer and a curse? The answer is uncomfortable. Because Ivan weaponized fear as faith. He blurred the line between divine authority and political power so completely that opposing him felt like opposing God. And in a country shaped by centuries of invasion, famine, and religious fatalism, that kind of logic took root easily. It was easier to believe he was righteous than to believe the horror was meaningless. This belief system endured long after his death. Russian folk tales cast Ivan as a wise devil, a ruler who tortured the wicked, tricked the greedy, and punished injustice with poetic cruelty. He was not gentle, but he was just, in the way fire is just, indiscriminate, cleansing, and final. And so, generations were raised on stories where violence brought order, where fear was a teacher, where czars had the right to destroy in order to preserve. That's the real legacy, not the palaces, not the laws, not the land gained or lost, but the normalization of authoritarian morality, the idea that kindness is weakness, that compromise is betrayal, that to lead, one must crush. Even during periods of liberalization in Russian history, brief moments of reform or openness, Ivan's shadow loomed. Reformers feared that too much freedom would unravel the nation. Conservatives invoked Ivan's name to demand control. Intellectuals wrote plays about him. Artists painted him with blood-streaked halos. And beneath it all, his victims remained nameless. The thousands drowned in rivers, the women raped in burning villages, the children starved in forgotten forests. There are no monuments for them, just silence. Because Ivan didn't just kill people, he killed memory. He made it dangerous to remember truthfully. He filled the national story with his version, his righteousness, his God-given fury. And once the lie is told long enough, it becomes heritage. Even now, historians struggle to untangle fact from fable. How many did Ivan really kill? Was Anastasia poisoned, or just ill? Did he truly murder his son in a fit of rage, or was that story mythologized? We may never know, because Ivan didn't just burn cities. He burned the archives, he erased contradictions, rewrote events, replaced reality with performance, and now, centuries later, we're left with echoes, with rumors, with blood-stained chessboards and sainted tyrants, and a lingering truth: sometimes the dead rule longer than the living. In the cold crypt beneath the Cathedral of the Archangel, Ivan's tomb remains, ornate, shadowed, still. Tourists pass by it in reverence or curiosity, many not realizing that beneath the marble lies the remains of a man who once ordered entire towns to be wiped from the map. There are no screams echoing through the cathedral now, no dog-headed riders thundering through midnight streets. But the silence is deceptive, because Ivan's impact wasn't in what he built, but in what he broke. He shattered the very idea of trust. Under his rule, loyalty became a liability. The more devoted you were, the more dangerous you became. A favorite today could be a corpse tomorrow. Ivan's system didn't reward honesty, competence, or courage. It punished them. He taught a generation of Russians to survive through invisibility, to speak less, to hope less, to feel less. That spiritual erosion was worse than any battlefield loss. It left a psychological scar that endured far beyond his death. Even as Russia modernized, built factories, opened universities, mapped its vast terrain, the ghost of Ivan remained. In every purge, every censorship, every accusation whispered into the ears of power. It's no accident that Soviet Russia, centuries later, became a surveillance state. The KGB didn't invent fear-based governance. They perfected what Ivan began. The Oprichniki rode on horseback. The NKVD used phones and files. The method changed, but the philosophy did not. Control, through isolation, through uncertainty, through ritualized cruelty disguised as loyalty tests. Ivan showed that if you break people just enough, not so much that they die, but enough that they're afraid to think, they'll police themselves. That's the ultimate tyranny, not torture chambers or public hangings, but a world where no one knows what's safe to feel. In this way, Ivan's rule wasn't just historical. It was psychological engineering. And perhaps that's why his name still sparks conflict. Because to some, he represents strength in chaos, a reminder that Russia survived. To others, he is the reason why Russia never healed. His reign wasn't the product of foreign invasion or external threat. It was self-inflicted. That's what makes it so terrifying. It wasn't done to Russia. It was done by Russia. And it set the pattern for centuries to follow. There's a Russian proverb, "He who remembers the past sees the future." But what happens when the past has been rewritten by the hands of a tyrant? That is the final legacy of Ivan the Terrible. He didn't just rule a country, he authored its memory. In modern Russia, Ivan's image has been rehabilitated by some state voices. Schoolbooks call him a complex figure. Museums display his letters with reverence. Some leaders praise his ability to centralize power and protect national interests. The same traits once condemned are now cast as necessary evils, and in some corners, not evil at all. Statues rise where mass graves were once dug. Documentaries call him a misunderstood genius. Government officials say he made Russia strong. But strength is not the same as health, and fear is not the same as loyalty. Ivan's rule proved that a nation can be unified and simultaneously hollowed out. That you can silence millions and still claim victory. That brutality can be dressed in religious robes and crowned in gold and still poison the soul of a people. Because a kingdom ruled by trauma doesn't remember with clarity. It remembers with shame, with confusion, with nostalgia for false stability. Ivan's Russia became a place where trauma was passed down like heirlooms, where people didn't just inherit land or names, they inherited fear. And once that becomes the foundation of a society, undoing it is nearly impossible. That's why every time Russia faces crisis, economic collapse, protest, foreign threat, the instinct isn't reform. It's to look for another Ivan, not the man himself, but the model. Someone who can crush dissent, purge rivals, unify through fear. Someone to make the trains run on time, even if the tracks are lined with bodies. This is not unique to Russia. History shows us that in every society, there's a temptation to trade liberty for safety, memory for myth, truth for power. Ivan was not the last ruler to exploit that temptation. He was simply the first to show how effective it could be. And how, even after death, a tyrant can continue to reign. Not through force, not through law, but through legacy, through the belief that maybe the terror was worth it. So now we ask, was Ivan the Terrible truly insane? Or was he something worse? Rational in his cruelty, deliberate in every step toward despotism. History offers no clean answer. Some psychiatrists retroactively diagnose him with bipolar disorder, temporal lobe epilepsy, or paranoid schizophrenia. Others say he suffered from trauma-induced psychopathy, a product of his brutal childhood and constant betrayals. But in the end, the clinical terms don't matter as much as what they enabled. Because whatever the cause, Ivan used his mind, damaged or not, to construct a machinery of fear that functioned far beyond his moods. He created systems, he trained successors, he encoded terror into bureaucracy, and he cloaked it all in faith. That's what made him so effective. He didn't torture in secret. He did it as a performance, with sermons and pageantry, robes and incense. His victims were not just killed. They were cleansed, publicly, for the good of the state. This merger of spirituality and authoritarian violence created a psychological snare from which Russia has never fully escaped. Centuries later, during Stalin's purges, victims were forced to confess to absurd crimes in public show trials. just as Ivan forced nobles to confess to treason before execution. And like Ivan, Stalin demanded these rituals not for proof, but for domination of narrative. Truth wasn't what happened. Truth was what the ruler said it was. And if history is written by the victors, who even wrote with a dagger, he turned the boyars, once powerful aristocrats, into cowed instruments of the state. He turned priests into political tools. He turned fear into law. And when all that was done, he looked upon the wreckage and called it order. Even his contradictions became part of the myth. He was the sadist who cried while killing, the reformer who burned towns, the churchgoer who drowned monks, the devout Christian who believed pain purified the soul and enacted that belief with fire. Russia didn't forget him because it couldn't. He's in the architecture of the Kremlin, in the iconography of Orthodox saints, in the language of every ruler who demands obedience for the good of the people. He's not buried, he's entrenched, not just in Russia's past, but in the psychology of power itself, because Ivan teaches us something timeless, that the most terrifying tyrant is not the one who hides in the shadows. It's the one who believes he's right.